The wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is once again back in the news cycle over some of her political activity. Specifically, there were some shady anonymous donations made to a group that she had founded through a think tank, or I'm sorry, co-founded, but headed by, through a think tank that was looking to bring some hearings before the Supreme Court. Possible conflict of interest here. All right, so now, the Washington Post reports that a group headed by Thomas, Ginni Thomas, received nearly $600,000 in anonymous donations over the past 3 years. In fact, the newly revealed donations were channeled through a right-wing think tank as something called a fiscal sponsorship. I could use a fiscal sponsorship right about now. Don't we all? Don't we all? But just tends to be something that happens on the right with these gigantic right-wing think tanks. Now, her group is called Crowdsourcers for Culture and Liberty. And they're crowdsourcing some dark money. Now, they call it a fiscal sponsorship. I'm going to call it a bribe. And I'm sure you will too, once you get the details. This arrangement effectively hid the details about this group's activities and spending, as well as the donors. Now, look, here's how it worked. Anonymous donors had given a think tank called Capital Research Center funds totaling $596,000 designated for crowdsourcers, as according to tax filings and other required documentation, which again is pretty sparse on details. $400,000 of that money was routed through another nonprofit called Donors Trust. Donors Trust then steered money from undisclosed wealthy donors to different conservative causes. Now, the documentation does not say how the money was spent and how much Ginni Thomas, whose main income comes from her consulting firm, was paid. Now, at the same time that they were receiving this money over the span of 3 years, the Capital Research Center had been looking into, getting a case involving fuel emissions regulations in Oregon before the Supreme Court. They didn't like the regulations. They wanted the court to hear it and to rule in favor of what we assume to be were donors in the fossil fuel sector. So, and of course, she happened to be head of that very group that was getting all this money. Weird. Now, the court ultimately declined to take up the case, and I don't know how Clarence Thomas had ruled in hearing, and whether he was in support of hearing the case or not. But remember, it is not just him. And I'm actually surprised to see the very, super incredibly corporate court reject hearing a case that would benefit corporations. But still, it seems like this was a case of possible influence peddling, perhaps a bribe. Look, when these groups go through so many lengths to cover up the details about how much people were paid, where the money went, what it was spent on, etc., that's a pretty big indication to me, especially when they're at the same time, the timing of this, trying to deregulate something on the Supreme Court through a group organization that has some very close ties to a Supreme Court justice. I don't know. Seems like some influence peddling, trying to get her influence, and most importantly, to get his influence. Now, the Post also noted how extremely secretive the group is. So these donors definitely trying to protect themselves and be completely anonymous. And so members had communicated through a private Google group, according to emails obtained by the Washington Post. Apparently, they weren't secretive enough. And those emails contain warnings not to share any information that could reveal the identities of the group's members. One said, absolutely do not forward emails from here without removing all identifying information from this listserv, warned one. So, look, there is a reason. There is a reason that they wanted to keep all of this a secret. Maybe it just has to do with, I don't know, these donors, I would assume corporate donors, lobbyists, not wanting to be named because then it would look bad on them. It would look bad on their, their companies, and they would get maybe some social media backlash, or it could again point to some conflicts of interest in trying to land these kinds of cases in front of the court through the influencing of the family member of this specific justice. Look, overall, according to a legal expert who is also an expert in ethics, if Thomas was paid for her work with crowdsourcers, either directly or through her consulting firm, then yes, there could be a recusal issue depending on the size and timing of the payment. Now, she does run, as I mentioned, a for-profit consulting firm. Now, the reason that it is, I think, mainly for-profit as opposed to a nonprofit consulting firm or nonprofit organization, is that there's less disclosure requirements on a for-profit firm. And so, that said, as a Supreme Court justice, her husband Clarence must list the source of his wife's income on the annual financial disclosure forms. However, he does not have to list the amount. And since 2018, Liberty Consulting, her firm, was the sole source of income for Mrs. Thomas, and that the firm had paid her salary and benefits. So again, if the firm was paid, that goes into her pocket. If she was paid directly by crowdsourcers, that also goes into her pocket. Both of those, definitely a conflict of interest if she got paid. And we don't know because we don't have access to where the money went from these donations. So all we can rely on is their word, which, let's be honest, that doesn't mean a whole lot. It just doesn't mean a whole lot. Now, some of the issues that her firm consulted on as well involved the Trump administration, like Trump's Muslim ban. Now, there's a nonprofit called the Center for Security Policy who reported in its tax filings that it paid Liberty Consulting a total of $236,000 in 2017 and 2018, according to the New Yorker. A political action committee run by another crowdsourcers member and direct mail pioneer also reported paying Liberty $5,000 for video production. And look, that's just crowdsourcers and her involvement. She actually got even more personally involved in the Trump administration because you do remember her having text exchanges with, of course, Mark Meadows, Trump's chief of staff, talking about how to push the big lie and to make sure that Donald Trump overthrows democracy. So, yeah. Now, Trump had, by the way, also said that he hoped that his voter fraud, the big lie stuff, would end up going to the Supreme Court and that the Supreme Court would rule that he could remain president, which, again, incredibly unprecedented move, and it didn't turn out that way. So, look, I do believe, based on what I know, that yes, this was an attempt to influence Thomas through Ginni Thomas. Was it effective? I guess you'd really have to look at the votes to determine that he has taken. But he has not recused himself, as far as I know, from any cases. And so, not only that, but there's a lot about the Supreme Court justices and what they do that we don't necessarily we're not privy to it. Not only that, but the court doesn't have a code of ethics that they're forced to follow. And so all of this is pretty much allowed. There's really nothing we can do. These Supreme Court justices can easily do corruption from the bench, and nobody can do a goddamn thing about it. That's something that, again, if you want to, and by the way, it's not like this is, corruption. Let me rephrase that, right? It's not as if corrupt people didn't look at the court and say, why don't we just corrupt the court? Go through them, and then we can have corporate rule, because that actually already happened. And so about the time where they, decided, I believe it was the Powell memo, where they figured out, I think it was Nixon that figured it out, that, hey, why don't we just corrupt the Supreme Court and then use the Supreme Court to deliver this country to corporations and wealthy interests? And that's exactly what has happened.